part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
August is officially a very important month, also known as Dev Patel Month, here at Petticoats and Poppies. We have been planning to do this month with this double feature for a very long time, but the Green Knight kept getting pushed back because of COVID, and we just had to delay our satisfaction and gratification a little bit longer. But we're finally able to bring to you this very special month dedicated to period dramas starring Dev Patel.
So we're starting with The Green Knight, which, as you may know, was just released recently. So this is an exciting episode for us as well because we're getting to talk about a new film. It is an epic medieval fantasy film, and it is based loosely, which we'll talk about, on the 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is written, edited, and directed by David Lowery, and it stars Dev Patel, Alicia Vikander, Joel Edgerton, Saartjie Choudhury, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, and Sean Harris, along with a pretty actually large ensemble cast. It is by the studio A24.
Which makes all the sense in the world.
Sometimes I really do think if you've seen one A24 movie, you've seen them all. But if you know A24, then you know what you're getting into. And it's gotten very strong reviews from critics. And less of a strong response from general audiences.
Shocking.
Whenever I made these notes, it had an 89% on Rotten Tomatoes for the critics score and a 53% audience score.
And Cinema Scores gave it a C+.
A C+. A reminder, if you don't know how Rotten Tomatoes scores work, essentially the percentages taken of the critics or audience members who have rated it fresh, which means they have given it a overall positive rating. So that's 89% of critics who actually like this movie and only 53% of audiences. My audience was certainly confused. I've never experienced anything like it. Whenever the movie ended, my whole audience, no joke, let out this weird little chuckle. Like, that laugh that you do whenever you're like, what the hell have I just seen? And you're just kind of like, the whole flippin' theater did that. It was the weirdest thing I've ever experienced in a movie theater.
Oh God.
Maggie also knows that I came straight out of this movie, and texted her and was like, yes, I need you to explain this to me. So I talked to Maggie on the phone for quite a while after watching this to get her to explain it to me. And then for like an hour and a half after that, I was texting with my friend Jacob to try and sort out what certain things in it meant, because we were both like, okay, we need to figure out what this movie is. Which is all to say, it's pretty confusing. And I think it's purposefully confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's meant to be ambiguous. It's one of those films.
It's an A24 film.
It's very A24. It's very indie. It's very David Lowery. Like, it's everything that you would expect from the description of it. Mm-hmm. And even I was like, I don't think I get it. And I think of myself as someone who's fairly literate whenever it comes to film. So for anyone watching who has seen it, if you were confused, like, don't feel bad about that.
I don't blame anyone for feeling confused by this one.
And if people don't like this movie, I totally understand why. I will say, for me, I came out of the movie and I was like, I didn't like that. There were parts that I liked, but I didn't like that overall. And then, like, by about 5 hours later, and by the next day, I was like, okay, no, actually, I really did appreciate that. I don't have the love for it that a lot of critics do, but I'm also not like an A24 person. Mm-hmm. That's not the kind of movies that I tend to like. But I do think there's a lot of merit to this film. Like, I think I settled on, I'm in between like a 7 and an 8 out of 10 on it.
That's about where I am.
Because, yeah, for the fact that I do think that, like, it's inaccessible to the point of that being a problem. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of good in it as well. For one thing, like, it's gorgeous. It's beautiful. The I mean, like there's these shots in it in this one scene of Gawain swimming, that are absolutely lovely. And when I say it's beautiful, I mean like the film itself is beautiful. Obviously, Dev Patel is also
Gorgeous.
beautiful in the movie, and like I'm not gonna lie, were it not Dev Patel, I might even feel differently about this film. But he really does save a lot of it for me. I also I was so excited. I don't know where I've been. I thought I had watched the trailer. Maybe I just don't remember if the trailer doesn't give a lot of it away. I did not realize Sean Harris was in this. I love Sean
Well,
Harris.
he looks so different.
Okay, maybe that's I definitely had not looked at a cast list because I also did not know that Erin Kellyman is in it. And I love Erin Kellyman. I loved her in everything from like the Solo movie to the Les Mis miniseries to obviously Falcon and the Winter Soldier. But you also can tell like how not used to seeing things in the theater I am, because I literally almost went Erin out loud when she first appeared. And I had to like hold it in. But yeah, I think it's a beautiful film. The costumes are fascinating. I'm sure, Maggie, you're going to talk about this later, but truly, I was like, Padme Amidala called. She wants her dresses back. I do think it drags in the middle, and it's got a lot of issues with pacing. I like the Winifred part a lot, but otherwise, it really doesn't get interesting until he meets the Lord and Lady, who are played by Alicia Vikander and Joel Edgerton. But I also think that ending is so strong and so striking that it makes up for a lot of what's in the middle of it. And that's what I've heard, like, a lot of my other critics friends have said, like, you know, I really thought the movie had lost me, and then the ending brought me back. So for anyone who is listening to this maybe before watching it, I mean, first of all, like, a warning that there's going to be spoilers.
So many.
All around. But for a movie like this, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But if you want to see it with no spoilers,
stop listening,
come
because
back and
I'm
listen
getting
to this
ready
after.
to describe
stop.
everything.
Yeah. But I do think that, like, if you're going to see it, just hang in there through the middle section, because it does get better towards the end, I think.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I
Now,
agree.
Maggie, give your thoughts and then tell us what this movie's actually about, because I still only have a shaky understanding.
Oh gosh. Okay, so first of all, huge thank you to A24 for hooking me up with a screening of The Green Knight. I am a lifelong massive Arthurian nerd and have been super hyped about this film since production was first announced. I saw it with my mother, who is decidedly not an Arthurian nerd. Our reactions were on entirely opposite sides of the spectrum. So that was pretty fun. I had purposefully not read any reviews heading into my screening because I was seeing it a day after the embargo had lifted, and I wanted to go in without being like affected by anyone else's thoughts. And I'm actually shocked that so many critics who apparently loved it didn't really fully research it, because their reviews really were telling, and it was kind of strange to me. But I guess if you love A24, you don't necessarily need to like understand it. But still, I was confused because I skimmed through a few reviews from major notable publications, and they had misrepresented a bunch of the lore that's infused into the story. They failed to recognize that Alicia was in both of the roles. They wrongly credited the lady to the actress who plays the wife at the end. Yeah, doesn't even look the same. And they even failed to do the bare minimum of reading the Wikipedia page, which talks about the fact that the Lord kisses Gawain in the thing. So I saw a bunch of reviews that harped on that, and I was like, well, if you read even Wikipedia.
There's actually if you know the legend, the poem, there's less kissing.
There's so much less kissing. It's very
I'm like,
chaste.
Make Joel Edgerton kiss him more.
Right? I'm like, I don't, because a lot of people took issue with it. I'm like, one, it's in the poem, and two, there's nothing wrong with it, and there should have been more. It would have made that patch even more interesting.
I agree. I agree.
But like, by and large, I really enjoyed this film. I walked out of the theaters, and I was like, David Lowery, make more Arthurian legends, because you get it. I loved, like, I agree that like the middle part really dragged, and I was kind of like, okay, there's only Dev on the screen, which is nice and scrumptious and all, but like pick it up here. But I will say I have auditory processing issues, and I almost immediately judge a movie based on its sound design and if it's accessible and how they access it very creatively. And this was gorgeous. This was like a award-winning, deserving of awards, like sound mixing. So kudos to whoever worked on the sound on this. Absolutely inspired, made me want to revisit my own scripts that utilize sounds like this and like see how I can hone it in even better. So like much applause to the sound department. But like Nicole said, she called me immediately after watching it. And if you have watched it too and are wondering what you just saw, I am available for assistance. But now I'm actually going to offer it up right here and right now, so you can just come to my DMs afterwards. So essentially, Gawain is a do-nothing who lacks the valor and glory of the other knights of the Round Table. He's Arthur's nephew, so things have come very easily to him. In this adaptation, his mother summons the Green Knight in an effort to inspire her son to fulfill his knightly glory and valor. Instead, Gawain is still pretty uninspired. He fails to recognize that the Green Knight will do unto you what you do unto him, so he proudly ignores the call for mercy and cuts off the knight's head. He wastes his year on drunken brawls and brothels, and he doesn't care about Essel, which of course comes back to bite him in the ass later on. He ignores the scavengers' calls to show gratitude, and that comes back to royally screw him as well. All he had to do was pay him or even take him on as a page, because all of this was meant to be a test. Knights endure this like glorious knighthood quest. It's all about honor and respect and duty and valor, and he fails almost every single one of these tests. Winifred is really the only test that he passes because he does as she requests, though I will say he expects something in return, which I thought says a lot about that character and this adaptation of this character. He doesn't really understand that this is so much more than a game. This is like his big test to fulfill his glory. But because he does as Winifred requests, he receives the axe in return. So he kind of gets what he's lost back. Think of it like a video game. If you mess up at the beginning and you lose all of your items, there's probably going to be a chance to revisit and reclaim those items. And that's kind of how this works with a quest. So he has his axe returned, and then he goes on and he ends up at the Lord and the Lady, which is this next quest, which is about temptation. And this is where I thought that it got a little bit murky about whether or not he passes this test, because I don't feel like he necessarily passed it, but the implication is that he did pass it because he receives his sash. So he gets his sash back, which was also stolen from him. So he, I guess, essentially passes that. And then at the end, it's basically a vision of the future where he returns to the Round Table under false pretenses, failing to uphold the promise that he made to the Green Knight, and in return he ruins everyone's life and the kingdom because he lacks the merits of a true knight, and only ruin can come from that, essentially. So you can interpret the end as his life flashing before his eyes, and his final act is to do the knightly thing and follow through with his vow and die. So that's essentially what the story is. He played a lot with circular themes. There was that weird moment right after he loses everything when he's tied up by the scavenger, and we see this glimpse, this alternative version where he dies, which is ultimately still what happens, which I thought was, there's some things that are up for interpretation, and I think that's really great with how Lowry has created this, because as we know, folklore gets passed down and lore evolves and changes, and it's all about the storytellers and how they interpret things. And so I think there's something interesting that he took bits and parts of other Celtic and Welsh lore, like Winifred, which I'll talk about later on, and pulled it into this to create something that's similar but brand new and still contains the same core tenets, basically, of a knightly quest.
I think one of the interesting things about it is whenever you think about, this whole idea of these tests, it almost feels like he keeps like scraping by on them.
Just
Like
barely.
he's passing them, but he's not necessarily doing it in the knightly way all the time.
Mm-mm.
Sometimes he's doing it just sort of his own like haphazard way, and like it works, but like I think it kind of hints towards the idea that eventually there is going to be a test that he can't pass, and that like he's scraping by passing these tests, but it doesn't mean that he would be a good knight, or particularly that he would be a good king, as we see sort of in his vision of whatever sort at the end.
Because
And
even
I think,
the vision, he's just scraping by. He has a son, he has an heir, but it's because, oh God, that scene when he throws the money down on the bed after the baby is taken, I was like, kill him now, chop his head off, he does not get to become king. I was, my heart
well, and
hurt.
then even then, like, you know, he has this bastard heir, but then even he dies, so like
tragically on the battlefield,
right? So it's like he keeps doing things only just right enough so that they later fail. And I think what's also complicated though is that obviously I feel like a lot of the movie, I was trying to figure out like what's real and what's not.
So confusing. As soon as he has those mushrooms, I'm like, is any of this real? Am I real?
There on out, I was like, is this movie theater real? Is this movie real? Like, what's happening? And then I started being like, well, maybe the not realness started before. Like, is any of it real?
I was like, did he actually die? And this is all like final thoughts, final dreams?
Because there's that like early thing where they like, you see him laying on the ground, and then you see like a corpse, like a skeleton,
and
then you see him again.
The whole rotation was weird. And then I was thinking about how that paralleled the Punch and Judy style story that was going on with the storyteller, where it was the circular wheel that was showing what was happening, and then the and it's all about the compulsion to repeat, the circularness of stories and folklore.
Yep. That's okay. I was talking to my friend Jacob about it, and he was like, maybe none of it's real. Maybe it's all from the point where the king is all like, tell me a story, like tell me something, like maybe just nothing after that is real. And I was like, huh.
And then you have the whole him on fire at the like very start, which is never revisited again,
ever. Like it really is the kind of movie where I think you have to just sort of give yourself over to it and accept.
Maybe we should have had shrooms.
Truly, I do wonder, like...
Is it a different film?
Was I supposed to be under the influence for this film? Of what? I'm not sure.
That I should have, like, had a, like, glass of wine before seeing it.
And now that I'm thinking about it, you know, I said that, like, after a few hours I liked it better. I also had a couple of drinks.
Well, there you
by the
go.
time I decided that I liked it. So maybe that's the key.
Maybe that is the key.
I really did think about getting a beer because the movie theater I go to, the Regal that I go to, has a bar.
Oh, I love that.
And then I was like, I have to drive. I probably shouldn't be drinking, but...
I know. I was at an AMC and like I walked right past the MacGuffin and I was like, oh, I should go in there and have a drink before this. And I was like, no, I don't want to like go to my first like fancy screening. Yeah.
That's truly, I do think that like if you are in a position, if you are someone who drinks and you're in a position where you're not driving afterwards
or you're somewhere
whatever,
where it's legal to smoke weed. I mean,
right? Like I do wonder if maybe like if that would just chill you out enough to like accept what's happening.
Yeah, because this is very much a film that we have to accept what's happening as much as Gawain has to accept what's happening.
Yeah, and like listen, I'm a Ravenclaw Virgo. Just accepting things as not logical is not.
I'm a Slytherin Pisces, and I too struggle with that.
Yeah, like. I think we're both people who like to like be able to rationally explain things. I mean, obviously we have this whole podcast where we're like, let me give you facts. Let me give you
fact-based.
Hard facts.
I will,
and that doesn't exist.
I know we didn't like, this is not in our notes, so this is actually going a slight tangent, but when I was writing my review, I realized that it's all women who give him chances. His mother creates the entire chance for him. Essel, there's that whole scene in the forest where she's like, when you come back, will you make me a lady? And he doesn't answer, and she's still like, here's a token, and then let me jokingly move your mouth to say, why, yes, I'll make you a lady. Like, she's giving him a chance even though she shouldn't, and then the lady is another figure who like gives him the chance. Winifred gives him a chance. Like, Winifred, it's all is very, which really inherently ties back to Welsh and Celtic lore surrounding the King Arthur mythos, because like obviously Morgan and Guinevere and all of these very strong female characters who drive so many knightly, quests. So I think there's some of that tied back to it. But I also think it's a really interesting uh, gender politics, I guess, because it's definitely
Definitely.
a man who does nothing, who's given so many chances to do the right thing by a woman, which I think a lot of us can relate to.
I also think there's something to be said for the fact that, like, I do think there's maybe something being said about nature and the natural world.
Oh yeah.
And women are particularly in these times, I think, as well, supposedly like closer to the natural world. You know,
Hmm.
there's a reason that we refer to the earth as a she. Because the
Oh,
only
most
other
of the giants were women too, because
the
there's
giants
one
are women.
nursing a baby.
I think, and the other thing that like being that we see giving him a chance is this actual fox.
Hmm.
Which, you know, so that kind of all ties into this idea that like I don't know, I just think maybe there's some commentary there, whereas I think in the original poem there's more this idea of you know, Christ figures and that sort of thing, whereas I think in this it's sort of more traded for less of a religious connotation and maybe something to do with, you know, the idea of nature
Hmm.
and the earth. And, you know, the Green Knight is literally a tree basically that is moving around.
Midlife crisis Groot.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, is he gonna say I am Groot? Like, I was waiting for it to happen. I was truly waiting.
But you did some research about the original poem.
I did. Um, so I decided to look into the original poem, which is called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and it is a medieval English chivalric poem. It's a romance poem, a romantic poem, and it's part of the Arthurian tradition. It's one of the best known, actually, which is interesting because I say that, and yet obviously I feel like a lot of people only really know about, you know, this whole idea of King Arthur and the Round Table, and then they know about like Lancelot and Guinevere.
Hmm.
Uh, but for anyone who's going to know more than that, this is actually one of the ones that they likely will have come across. It fits into the romantic genre because that denotes that there is some sort of hero going on some sort of quest to test him, which definitely is happening here. What's interesting is we actually don't really know that much about where this poem comes from. Its author is unknown. There are some scholars who think they know who it might be, but uh, it's definitely not definitively known who it was. They're typically either referred to as the Gawain poet or the Pearl poet, the Pearl being another poem in the same manuscript. The poet definitely seems to have been university educated. They may have been a clerk, some sort of a state official. They likely were from Cheshire, based on the dialect in the landmarks mentioned. Uh, the poem is in this manuscript of these other poems, Purity, Patience, and the Pearl, which are all very religious poetry, whereas this poem is much less religious. It still has definitely like religious connotations to it, but it's not religious in the same way that the others are. So it's actually kind of unclear why they were grouped together. It was probably written in the mid to late 14th century. So we have this one early manuscript of it, but it's actually a copy of the original, and it's from around 1400. It is in the British Library, and it is called MS Cotton Nero AX. I don't exactly understand why it's called that, but that is how they refer to it at the British Library. It is written in a a North or West Midlands dialect. But most students who would read it today are going to be reading a modern translation of it. And later, I'm going to go into a bit talking about different editions of this poem whenever I'm also talking about other adaptations of it. It has a lot of long alliterative lines, and it uses what is called the bob and wheel metrical form. And so what that means is that each stanza ends with a short half line that's only 2 syllables, and that is the bob. And it's followed by a mini stanza of longer lines that rhyme internally, and that is the wheel. So it's called the bob and wheel. It is 101 stanzas, over 2,500 lines. And as I said, I'll go into this a little bit more later, but it was first actually published in 1839. Tons of translations, tons of retellings. A lot of people are familiar either with the J.R.R. Is it Tolkien or is it Tolkien?
Tolkien.
Tolkien. Okay. A lot of people are familiar either with the J.R.R. Tolkien version or the Simon Armitage version. The Green Knight is sometimes seen as a Christ figure. Sometimes he's seen as the Green Man of folklore. That was a figure from English folklore. one big difference I think between the film and the movie, sorry if you get into this, but a lot of times in the poem he's thought to be green. He's not, as we said, he kind of looks like Groot.
Yeah.
But it draws on Welsh, Irish, and English stories to sort of come together and form this poem. But I just think it's very interesting that we have this poem, but we don't really know like where it's from.
And
who
I
wrote it.
loved that Lowry had the anonymous at the start of the film.
Yes, I thought that was really cool. And I do like that, I think that it is a poem that lends itself to being adapted. I still have some questions on if this was the way to do it. But yeah, I think that the history of the poem itself and the fact that we don't really like know where it's from or who wrote it also sort of leaves it open to be reinterpreted and sort of reworked, because it's not like whenever, if you're reworking like a Charles Dickens novel for your own use, it's like, okay, well, Charles Dickens wrote that and he had intent with it. Whereas this is a little easier whenever you don't even know who wrote it to be like, it's my story now.
And I think that's why I think if this had been like an actual like well-known King Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot type story, I think that critics would definitely not have ended up enjoying it because of the ambiguity aspect. But I think that the Green Knight, because of its kind of unknown origins and its various different translations, because the original is very different from the adaptation in my opinion, because it goes from Middle English to mostly modern English. I think that lends itself to this kind of rolling wheel-like ambiguity. When you were saying I'm terrible at knowing. I can read this kind of poem like very well, but don't ask me to tell you how the stanzas are written. But when you were just talking about the fact that it's written in this wheel form, it makes sense that there's so much circular imagery in this. And I almost wonder if Lowry borrowed from seeing that and thinking, how can I adapt this style of writing into visuals? Because there is a lot of this kind of circular bobbing in the story. And if you read it aloud, I read like half of the poem aloud to my mother today when we were taking a walk and trying to get into like the feel and the rhythm and stuff. I see a lot of that cadence actually brought into the film, strangely enough. So I really do think that Lowry is gifted in capturing this sort of poetic essence that I think a lot of other filmmakers are not. I think that's a very special skill set. But the film and the poem differ in a few glaring fashions. I think the most obvious one is that in the original text, Morgan Le Fay, the very well-known figure of Arthurian legends, is the one who called upon the Green Knight to test Gawain's ability to be a knight. Of course, in the film, it ends up being his mother and her two sisters, fellow witches, never really fully explained. I got a lot of Fates vibes from them as well. So I'm not entirely certain what Lowry was doing with that. I wish they had names. And I know that he did that very intentionally. It's the Lord, the Lady, the King, the wife, like very intentional on the very simplistic storytelling. But I think that these characters might have been deserving of names, even if they were just throwaway, since we do know that it is, of course, Morgan Le Fay who is this integral part of this story. And that doesn't get revealed into the very end of the poem. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read the poem. And as you were saying, the Green Knight looks more like the Celtic Green Man. He's depicted more as this like nobleman who doesn't look dissimilar from like how Sir Gawain's dressed. So I like that they adapted it and borrowed from more of this Celtic mythos to make the Green Knight look more like Groot. But that's not at all what he was supposed to have looked like. That's all I'm gonna see now is Groot. While the fox,
same. I think I ruined it for us.
No, I'm so sorry. And while the fox does factor into the original story, the Lord is out fox hunting. He brings back the fox's pelt when the whole kiss thing happens. The fox is, of course, this vaguely integral part of the film. Please don't ask me what he says in the film. I have no idea. I could not understand him.
No clue.
It was cool. I love foxes, so I was like super excited to see a fox, and I was like, cool. I can't hear, so if I could just have subtitles for the foxes speaking, that would be cool. It'd be really nice. But I think that worked really well, like you were saying, with like the nature and being guided and nature as part of the story. I thought it worked, even though it's not really part of the original poem. Gawain never takes off his sash in the poem. In fact, he returned to the round table to be lauded for his heroics, and basically like all of the other knights are like, we should all wear green sashes. It's a girdle, actually, is what it's called, which is obviously not what we call girdles today. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, like the whole giant thing, which I think we very briefly touched on earlier in the episode, is a really weird moment in the film. It's not in the poem. However, that is borrowed from other Arthurian legends. The giant of Mont Saint-Michel was this giant that ravaged France. Both Arthur and, I'm going to slaughter this Welsh name, Gwalmachi Fab Gwea, are featured as giant slayers in Welsh mythology. So obviously Lowry was borrowing from that. Saint Winifred is not part of Arthurian legends. She is allegedly a real woman that existed in like the 600s. I'll get into talking about her later on, but I like why he ended up including her into the story, and I'll talk about that later. So that was cool. The scavenger is not part of the story. Once again, though, I think that it works how he pulled this kind of familiar trope of being tested along the way, this imagery of fallen man, this battle. We kind of get hints that some other stuff is going on at the world at large, especially in that moment. I don't know if you noticed this, but like one of the barns are on fire. Like while he's sleeping, like, so he's sleeping at the start of the film, and we see like out the window this like lady and this man like rushing away with like their bags. They leave their bag behind on the ground when they ride off as well, which I was like very confused by. But like this stable barn house is on fire in the background. It's never discussed in the film. But then we see there's this massive battle that has taken place like mere miles from wherever King Arthur and I guess Camelot, where they're all living. So I'm like, what is happening outside of Camelot? Which then again adds to this like what's real and what's not, because then battlefields are brought up at the end with the sun dying, and like it's very trippy. But by and large, Lowry follows the essence of the poem. It doesn't really change too much of what the poem is getting at. I think it works the way the ending kind of shifts it onto its head a bit, because in the end, he does come home heroic and welcomed for avoiding death, basically. And I think this works more realistically.
I'm still, every so often I feel like I don't have words for this movie yet, and I think for anyone who has seen it, they'll know why I'm like this.
It's very confusing. Oh, and the original poem is very chaste. There is no inspired scene. I don't know. I don't want to
I
say
don't think
it.
we should
This is
say
a
it.
clean podcast, Nicole. But if you know, you know. It's the weird Oedipus Rex moment. I'm sorry, it is. You do not.
I'm still not over that. I just like cackled.
You do not make a point that his sash was made by his mother, and then at the end of your film, introduce a lady who is played by the same woman as his lover, who then says she made it in the heat of a very intimate moment. I was like, what is happening? Lowry, go to therapy.
Get thee to a therapist. Yeah.
Whew.
Oh boy. All right. I'm going to talk about Green Knight adaptations. To start off, just to talk about sort of different versions of the poem. It was published in 1839 for the first time. Sir Frederick Madden published a Middle English version of it. Then in 1898, the first modern English translation was done by Jessie Weston. Jessie Weston's version is actually still often used today. If you read this poem in a class, you may have used Weston's translation. In 1925, J.R.R. Tolkien and E.V. Gordon published a new scholarly edition of it. Not to be confused with the fact that later in his life, Tolkien did do a modern English translation, along with a translation of the poem Pearl, which it was with. In 1967, Norman Davis published a revised edition of it. But like I said, students typically read it in modern English. A lot of times it's Weston's translation, sometimes Theodore Banks's 1929 translation. Marie Baroff did a 1968 translation that's sometimes used. And then she did there's a slightly revised version of it that was published again in 2010 in the Norton Critical Edition. So I thought that was interesting just because that was a female translator. There have been countless other ones as well. In terms of books based on it, though, there's a handful of them. In 1999, The Squire, His Knight, and His Lady was published, which is part of a larger young adult novel series. It's actually a fairly faithful adaptation from what I could find. In 2015, Augie and the Green Knight by Zach Weinersmith was a children's adaptation, which instead of having Gawain, has a girl in the lead, which I thought was kind of cool, but otherwise sort of draws on the original poem. So I thought that was fun. And in 2017, Emily Cheeseman published a graphic novel version, which I thought was also pretty fun. There have been 2 television adaptations, Gawain and the Green Knight in 1991, and then an animated series called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in 2002. The character of the Green Knight also features in an episode of Adventure Time, which I thought was interesting. There have been multiple theater productions and operas. The Tyneside Theater Company did a production at the University Theater in Newcastle in 1971. This one's interesting because the music was done in this medieval carol style, and they used folk instruments, and it also had a sword dance. So that's the reason that it's the one that people still talk about. Otherwise, the first opera that was ever done of it was in 1978. It was actually, I thought, kind of interesting to me that there wasn't one before that I could find. But it was by the composer Richard Blackford. There's another opera that premiered in 1991 just called Gawain. That was also kind of popular. And there was a BBC documentary in which the poet and the translator Simon Armitage sort of explored the work, talked about it, and went to some of the locations from the poem, which I thought sounded kind of neat. I'm like, I actually might see if I could get a hold of that. But there's 3 previous film adaptations. One of them is a short film from 2014 made by the French-Australian director Martin Belby. But the 2 proper films were actually both written and directed by Stephen Weeks, which is kind of weird. The first one was Gawain and the Green Knight, which came out in 1973. And the second one came out in 1984, and it was sort of the variant, The Legend of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
So are you telling me this was the Green Knight's variant?
Precisely, I'm sure.
Loki confirmed.
That one is interesting because that one had Miles O'Keefe and Sean Connery in it. So, obviously, I mean, I'm assuming that you'd never heard of those films. I'd certainly not heard of them.
I've seen both of them.
Have you?
I have. I went on a huge Arthurian kick freshman and sophomore year of college, and I watched every adaptation of Arthurian films that I could find on
I'm gonna safely
torrents.
say that most people.
No, I doubt anybody's really seen it. Also, young Sean Connery is a babe.
Oh yeah. But so I think in some ways we were overdue a new version of this. I think, I'm someone who I really like adaptations of things. I like having new adaptations of things. I will always be the first person to defend a book or a poem or a play or whatever getting readapted for the screen, as long as it's something that's, a fresh take on it. And I think that this is one that definitely was time, and I definitely think that this is the most how do I say this, inventive take on it, at least on screen. Obviously I'm not familiar with the operas or the plays based on it. I don't know. I wish I could have seen the sword dance musical. But
It's a shame there was no YouTube back then.
I know. I'm like, I wish there was a boot, but I don't think bootlegs of musicals existed in 1971. So not for something like that, anyways. But yeah, so I thought that was kind of interesting, though. It's definitely something that's like been adapted over time, but it's not something that's super sort of immersed in the culture in the way that, like I said before, that like Lancelot and Guinevere and some of that side of the Arthurian legend is.
Definitely. And now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk a bit about Saint Winifred. I watched a scene study today with the New York Times where Lowry said that he had been inspired by a singular line in the text about Holyhead and Holywell. It's like a throwaway line that just mentions that Gawain is basically like riding through this location, essentially. When he wrote Winifred into the story, he had Erin Kellyman in mind because he had seen Solo, a Star Wars story, and he loved her in it.
Me too.
Lowry also said that his purpose for Winifred in the movie was essentially to nudge Gawain towards integrity, which I thought was great. There was an interesting line in the scene study, if you listen to it, where he's talking about the whole Winifred scene and how it's supposed to be played kind of like an old-fashioned horror film, which they definitely captured that aesthetic, with her on the dolly sliding towards him, very evocative of those kind of images. He also said that he did the editing for the reaching into the cosmos scene himself. So when he's down in the water, like you see the stars overlaid.
Okay.
And I just have to say this line, like, is going to stick with me because Lowry said, if it looks a bit wonky, it's because I did the editing myself and I used a tutorial off of YouTube. So if you have a tutorial on YouTube about how to overlay stars or cosmoses onto like footage, you might have inspired the Green Knight. So, you deserve some sort of credit if this wins any sort of editing awards. Like, hold on to that. But that line just like cracked me up because I think that this is not a knock to A24 films because I like a number of A24 films, but that feels so much like a line from somebody who worked on an A24 film. So the real Saint Winifred was a martyr from the 7th century who was decapitated by her suitor, who was dismayed to learn that she wanted to become a nun. The suitor then threw her head into a pond, and sometime later, a saint rejoined her head to her body, and she came back to life. And so the Holywell Spring in Wales has become known to have healing powers. The details of Saint Winifred's life are gathered from the manuscripts in the British Museum, said to have been the work of a British monk named Illyrius, a contemporary of the saint who revived Winifred, and also from a manuscript in the Bodleian Library, generally believed to have been compiled sometime in around 1130 by Robert, the Prior of Shrewsbury. The shrine and well at Shrewsbury became a major pilgrimage spot in the late Middle Ages, but the shrine was destroyed by Henry VIII in 1540. Because why am I not surprised that Henry VIII destroyed a well to a female saint?
Henry VIII just destroyed everything. So
he destroyed everything. Good job, Henry VIII. You're a bit like Gawain. I'm just saying.
No, Maggie, don't be offensive to Gawain.
I'm sorry. Gawain is a good boy. He's just goalless.
Well, is he?
Well, okay. I'm still thinking about the throwing the money down on the bloody. Like, I was like, oh, you're a Henry VIII fellow.
Yeah, Mance does not respect women as I would like for him to.
No respect. But so Saint Winifred was reposed on November 3rd, 60 AD, and was buried in the monastic cemetery, and her feast day remains on that date for the cult of Saint Winifred, which still exists. In the original text of the Winifred tale, there is a reference to an annual gift of a cloak at the midsummer. which is a tantalizing glimpse at a lost pagan tradition. This is a rant for another day, but a lot of Christian religious rituals that were adopted at this period of time are directly borrowed from the pagan rituals that essentially are the base of Arthurian legends and the Welsh and Celtic religions at the time. And so Saint Winifred is one of those kind of interesting figures that kind of comes in right at this weird transitionary period. And she's very fascinating. I will say my mother was thrilled to see her in the film, but she was like, why was she not in the rest of it? She should have just been like a main character. Move aside, Gwen. This is Winifred's story now.
I mean, I agree. Give me just the Winifred movie.
Well, that was like, I came out of the movie and I was like, maybe he'll make a Winifred story because her story is fascinating. And I think he could do something really fun with that and some of the other characters.
David Lowry, keep Erin Kellyman employed.
Truly. I love her so much.
Same.
So now, of course, is, costumes. I will say that I'm quite disappointed that we are like 6 days into this film being released and there are no interviews with the costume designer.
If the costume designer is hearing this and would like to come on a special episode of our podcast, please hit us up.
Because I would love to talk to her. The costumes were designed by, I'm so sorry if I say your name wrong. I've listened, I've tried. Malgosia Trzanska, who recently worked on Tell Me Your Secrets, which I mentioned earlier on. I think I might have said this pre-show, but I reviewed it for Amazon. She worked on 6 episodes of Stranger Things. She did the costumes for Hell or High Water and the Joaquin Phoenix film You Were Never Really Here. So she's done a lot of like very well-known projects. She's also working on an upcoming project that's just called X. I think she is phenomenal at what she has done with particularly The Green Knight. The costume pieces in this film are very simple and very indicative of the types of characters that we encounter as the quest kind of unfolds. In particular, you have Gawain's clothes, which are prominent because he's obviously the singular character on screen for pretty much the entirety of the middle section of the film. There's a lot to his costumes, even though they're very simple. There's, as with most of the film, there's a lot of color theory used. Very strong primary colors. There's like whole scenes that are completely toned in yellow. There's the whole red scene. There's greens and blues, and it kind of evolves as Gawain's quest evolves. And this is reflected a lot in his clothing as well, particularly his cloak, which seems to almost change colors depending on what point in the story that he is in. There's also the scene at Christmas where Gawain is wearing an adapted version of what's called a gambeson, which is essentially like medieval under armor. It goes on underneath like your chainmail. I mean, it's quilted padding so that you could sustain blows, but it's like they created a decorative version of this. But when you see like the lines in it, it's very that quilted. You've probably seen it in other like medieval Middle Ages films. It's very noticeable, but they did a decorated, adapted version of it, which I thought was really nice. I also loved that they did chainmail for Gawain throughout most of his quest. He loses it, I think, after the encounter with the scavenger, but I love that it wasn't shiny. One of my biggest annoyances with films that focus on this period in time or any period in time that wears chainmail or armor in general is they make it so shiny. And it was not that shiny because they're out in the elements, which Gawain is out in the elements a lot. He falls down a hill. He's covered in mud. It's going to be very tarnished. And so I like that she was very attention to detail with that and that his armor was really tarnished. As you said, the women's costumes were really gorgeous. I was so hoping that she had done an interview since he had mentioned Star Wars. And he actually said in his interview about the Lady in the Lake kind of vibes of the Winifred scene that he was actually inspired by Star Wars Caravan of Courage. So I was hoping that I could find something from the costume designer and see if she was inspired at all by Padme's costumes. But no, but the women's costumes are beautiful in this. I loved what was being done. This isn't costumes, this is hair and makeup, but I loved what was done with the ladies' hair. That was also very evocative and inspired and different and very much fitting I saw some people being like, oh, the hair doesn't look right at all. And I'm like, have you ever looked at a medieval tapestry? Their hair looks like something out of Dracula. The one with Gary Oldman. You know, like the big cone hair, like that very weird, very inspired look. This film ticks all of those boxes for like the weird, gothic, macabre tapestry feel that I think Lowry was going for. And so I think all of that worked really well to create a really nice, well-rounded picture. And then, of course, I would be remiss not to mention the halo crowns, which are meant to evoke thoughts of medieval paintings and are really underlined by that religious iconography of the Madonna and Child that's painted onto the inside of his shield. And of course, playing into this idea that you mentioned, that these poems have this Christ kind of story to them. And so there's this weird parallel that I think that they try to pull with Gawain and Christ, and playing into this, like, the chosen one, the promised son, this kind of imagery that they're trying to pull from.
He's essentially, for part of it too, like, in a way, sort of out in the desert for 40 days.
And there's actually, in the poem itself, there's a reference to the crown of thorns that, like, is put upon his head. So, like, even the poem is like, this is a Christ figure. Which I think is interesting. Like, I don't want to get into this because we're, like, nearing the 1 hour mark, but, like, there's some interesting things as, like, a lit major wannabe to look at the actual text and to pull apart some of this imagery of, like, you know, like the extra books of the Bible that may or may not exist, and like Christ having fallen and like the whole like beauty of like that. I feel like maybe somebody was toying with those concepts.
Absolutely.
Because of this imagery of drawing a parallel to Christ, but then also Gawain falls, and he falls hard. And like the temptations, and like Christ is tempted in the Bible and the garden, and like, so all this stuff, like a lot to think about with the original text, and then how Lowry adapted it. It makes you think.
Very much so. I think it's also interesting because whenever we talk about costumes in a piece like this, one thing that I like about a piece like this is that in the fact that it is a period fantasy, is that it gives it some leeway to use with the costumes. You know, it doesn't...
Oh, yeah.
Because there's already that fantasy element, like, in my mind, it doesn't have to adhere to period accuracy at all anymore.
No.
And I love that it does take... Obviously, it does seem to take a lot of inspiration from, like you said, in particular, what we see on tapestries from this period. And also paintings as well, but largely it does feel tapestry inspired. But at the same time, it means that they can have sort of weird clothing that looks somehow both futuristic and very old, and it fits still, and it doesn't feel like it's breaking the world at all.
Another thing that I haven't mentioned anywhere, and it just came to me literally as we're talking, when the lady does that, I don't know what the practice is called, the portrait she takes of him, essentially, with the lighting. It looked a lot like the Shroud of Christ. That, like... Yes. Like, and I was like, is this intentional?
Okay, then, like, I literally was trying to figure out, since I saw it, what that reminded me of. It's the Shroud of Christ. Yeah.
It just came to me. Literally, as I was talking about the weird religious, like, implications of the poem and the thing, I was like, wait, that was supposed to look like the Shroud of Christ, because it's, like, the last thing taken of him before he goes to his death.
Oh my god.
Did we just figure out something else about this movie?
I think we just did that.
David Lowry, come on our podcast and let us talk about what you were going
David
for.
Lowry, I have questions.
And while you're here, we can talk about Ghost Story.
And we can talk about Eric and Kellyman. David Lowry, let's discuss Solo.
Yes, let's deep dive.
I also do want to talk about the fact that this movie had a budget of $15 million.
Incredible.
What they were able to do with the $15 million budget is mind-blowing. It's just incredible.
I mean, they saved a lot of money by having David do, like, all of it. Writing, directing, editing.
I mean, that is true. But to think about, you know, even just, like, the costumes, the set pieces. I mean, obviously, for one thing, like, they had to film in Dev in water at one point, it looks like. Oh,
yeah. So in that A Scene Study, he talks about that those 2 nights of filming that one scene. And the cottage is a cottage they found in Ireland, not far from where they were filming the rest of it.
Incredible.
They had their set deck make it look like the actual St. Winifred's cottage, which is still quote unquote standing today. And then they dug the well. He was like, it may or may not still be there. They actually dug the well for the scene. And then they did the water scene, obviously a different time. But they did all of Aaron's scenes in one night.
Oh my God.
And it all like was perfect weather. The fog hung right. Everything was like perfect conditions. But that I was like, that tells me that this film was like, it was on a tight budget. We're doing everything like on schedule, which I thought was great. But yeah, that scene study is really great. If anybody like wants to look for it, it's on like the New York Times YouTube channel. It's really cool. He talks about that whole entire Winifred scene. And I wish he could do commentary for the whole thing. So A24, can you release like a director's commentary for the whole film?
Please.
Like, I'll go back to the theater to see it.
Like,
remember when, was it Lionsgate that did that for Knives Out? They did the director's commentary, like a special screening at like Alamos.
That sounds familiar.
And you could, and like you could go listen to Rian Johnson talk about Knives Out. I would do that for this because I want to hear David Lowery's thoughts, unless David Lowery wants to come on our podcast.
Criterion Collection. Let's get Green Knight in there.
Yes.
With all the special features. But yeah, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, Maggie, before I wrap us up?
Oh, there's so much. There's so much. I have to control myself because I love religious imagery in film and in text. And so like that's something I could spend hours talking about because I think it's fascinating.
I mean, also the thing about this movie though is because like we said earlier, it's so ambiguous. I really and so much of it is metaphor and we all take something different from it. Exactly. There's so much that can be interpreted in it. I do think it's the kind of thing that like you genuinely could talk about it like all freaking day.
Truly. Like I had messaged a friend of mine like right after I came out of the thing and like they had gotten a completely different like message than I got or that my mom got. And then obviously so many of the reviews were so drastically different. And I think that's really neat. I know that a lot of people don't like ambiguous films. They like things to be like concrete, especially this new age of film goer. They want everything told to them. And I kind of like that this leaves room for interpretation, but at the same time, I wish that it had given more explanation because I feel like you needed to read a pamphlet before the film and then you needed a debriefing pamphlet after the film. And I think that's where the disconnect is with the modern audiences seeing it. Like, I think critics know to kind of like approach things and like research before they go into something. But if I'm standing at the Regal going, what am I going to watch this weekend? And it's between like Quiet Place and A Green Knight. And I'm like, oh, The Green Knight sounds cool. I don't know what that's about, but that kid from Skins.
Right, or you go because you're like, oh, I like Dev Patel.
Yeah, that kid from Skins.
You're like, oh, I like Dev Patel. I'll go see that. Yeah.
Yeah, like I had a friend who saw it opening night, like super excited, loved Dev Patel. They posted on Facebook, this is the worst movie I've ever watched. Like, all of you are liars. And I was like, this is exactly how audiences are going to react to this. Because if you don't know what you're getting into, it's a weird movie.
I think my thing is that I am someone who, I like a bit of ambiguity. Particularly in an ending to a film, I like a bit of ambiguity. But I do think that this film is ambiguous to the point of being inaccessible.
Oh, yeah, completely.
For a lot of it. And to the point of like, there's a chunk where I was like, it's so ambiguous that I'm not positive I care anymore.
That's where my mom was coming out of it. She's like, I don't care anymore.
Yeah. Luckily the ending, because I felt like I had a better grasp on the ending. So I was like, haha, I understood something. But it did kind of make me feel dumb. And I don't like when films make me feel dumb. Like I said earlier, I'm a Virgo Ravenclaw. That's not my ish. If something makes me feel dumb, I avoid it. That's why I haven't taken a science class since I was in 11th grade. But yeah, so I do think that like it maybe takes it a step too far. But I do like the fact that we're able to sort of talk about interpretation. For one thing, it gives us a good podcast.
It does. It does. And I get to be annoying and unload all of my Arthurian love and quests.
You're not annoying. You're very helpful, actually.
I'm serious. Like, I feel bad my services.
For people who don't have... I feel bad for people who don't have their own personal Maggie that they can call us. They come out of the movie theater. And I think... I feel like what I said to you was... what the did I just
you did. Like, literally, as soon as I answered the phone. And it was like 15 minutes of like debriefing you. Like, this is what you just saw. I think this is what Lowry was going for. Because, I mean, he more or less follows the quest format, which is obviously in a lot of, it's the hero's quest, but it's like different because Arthurian legends have this like kind of different twist to what we know as.
And because I kept being like, did he pass that test?
Well, that was what confused me because it's more concrete in the lore. But then if you think about how he receives whatever he's lost, and like the scavenger is clearly like he literally almost turns to the audience and breaks the fourth wall and is like, I'll do this for you. Like there's so much.
Yeah.
Like, if only you'd been gracious, if only you had given me money, like, this isn't going to go well for you.
Yeah.
It's interesting. And Gawain, I think, was such an apathetic character that sometimes it made it really hard to relate to him or to find some, because I don't look for myself in every character I watch, obviously, but I look for something that I can cling to and relate to with the central characters.
Some sort of motivation.
And he had no motivations. And I was like, this is like every like 20-something-year-old guy, basically.
I really do think, though, Lowry knew what he was doing when he cast Dev Patel. Because, like, and this is going to sound bad, maybe, but first of all, Dev Patel is very talented. He does a very good job in this. Like, his performance is very good, but also, he's Dev Patel. And so, like, for most of this movie, I was like, I really do not care about this character, but he's Dev Patel, so I'm gonna keep watching.
He's Dev Patel, like, shirtless a lot.
And then, like, yeah, like, in Chainbound, like, oh, okay.
Like, I will say, I love this current trend on, maybe it's just Star Wars Twitter that's saying this, but, like, everybody I know who's, like, in Star Wars Twitter and has just seen Green Knight, their first response, and maybe this is because the movie was a hit or miss for them, but they're like, Dev Patel for Force user. Like, where is Dev Patel's character in Star Wars? Like, we need him now, which I love. Yes. And then hearing all this stuff about Lowry being influenced by Star Wars, I was like, yes. I love that.
I would like for Dev Patel to get every role that he ever wants to play.
Truly, I don't understand why he's not in more.
Which, this is a good segue. So thank you for joining us for our 30th episode of Petticoats and Poppies. History
I can't believe it's been 30 episodes.
Me either. I hope that you all enjoyed this discussion of The Green Knight. I hope that we were able to maybe bring some clarity to you, to give you some new ideas about the movie. If you've not seen it, then hopefully you're going to go into it with a better grasp of what you're going to be seeing. Please, let us know, but be sure to come back later this month for part 2 of Dev Patel month, because you may be able to put together what we're going to be talking about, but it is another period drama, and this one is a proper period drama with Dev Patel in the lead, and I actually dropped an Easter egg that's a huge hint to what the episode is earlier in this episode.
You did.
So get excited.
You did.
I'm like Taylor Swift out here with the Easter eggs.
I know. We dropped 2 big ones as well in our last episode. So I think people are going to guess what it is, but we would love to hear from you on social media and hear what you think of The Green Knight. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Are you still confused? Are you still wandering through the moors of Ireland?
Are you out of the woods?
Are you out of the woods yet? Or are you folklore being passed down?
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me over at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and on the Earglue Media website, and of course, over on Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcast and over on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we'll be reading our reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured. And I know we have a new one waiting for us.
Oh, that's exciting. We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, wear your masks, and have a great summer.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies. We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, wear your masks, and have a great summer.
And don't eat any mushrooms.
Unless you want to.
Unless you want to hear the fox star. What does the fox say?
I was gonna go for it, but I won't.